everyone. Thank you, Annie. Thank you for guiding us through this experience so beautifully and so gracefully. So, remember, this reflective lens for this convening reminds us to remember African stories, to remember our roots, our innovation, our ingenuity in this context, and to look to what we have in our midst to inspire design thinking education. We have so much so that we can make our teaching more relevant, more practical. So let me tell you about the Design Thinking Stories project, which has really been an experiment in contextualized design thinking pedagogy. My husband was a lecturer at CPUT at Industrial Design, and he said to me, don't use such big words as pedagogy among academics, because then you really set the bar high and you have to say important things. And then he shared with me that a little Winnie the Pooh meme that says, I don't like it when people use big words. I'd rather they say simple things like, what time is lunch? So this project really is about grounding this in storytelling and not to get too highfalutin, not to get too hierarchical and exclusive in academic sort of terms, but to make this work feel really accessible and real and relatable. So the inquiry that we set out this project has been incubated within the Learning Lab, but it really emerged within conversations of the Design Thinking Network, from early conversations where we said, what do we need to do here? And I want to see if this plays. I hope this works. There we go.
When we started meeting as a working group very early on, we started discussing, what's the best way to expose people to design thinking as a mindset, as a process, as a way to solve problems, as a way to approach complex challenges in the world around us. And we realized from our experience as teaching design thinking or coaching design thinking that oftentimes the best way to do it is through, of course, storytelling.
We're looking for stories that will offer real-world examples of design thinking for teaching and learning purposes so that we can make that teaching practical and relatable, and to help illustrate the various teaching points related to design thinking.
We want our students to be exposed to the types of challenges in our own contexts, in our own cultures, but we don't want to import these stories and then ask them to kind of abstract or translate that learning to another context. Why don't we tell the story within our own context, in our own voice and from our own, rooted in our own cultures?
There are so many examples, there's so many stories, but they're just not African. And so this is a real opportunity to, I think of it as how we replace some of the great examples that we get, I hate to say Western, but, other sources, examples from our backyard, because we encounter them all the time. I have so many examples of big surprises that came out of testing products in the work I've done, but are they written up? No.
Design thinking right back to what the intention was, to find stories from our context. So the experiment we undertook was, instead of creating traditional case studies or teaching cases, which certainly gave us inspiration, we chose to build African design thinking stories. This gives us a more flexible and participatory approach, which honors African storytelling narratives and supports co-created learning in a range of formats. So they're intended to open up discussion, to ground that discussion in our context, and to be open to, the collection can include teaching cases, it can include case study methodology and research, but we want it to be inclusive of various formats in multimedia and not just textual sort of hierarchy as well. And the experiment was that these stories are not just simply about documenting cases of design thinking. You can Google, you can search for African examples of design thinking. What this is really about is about designing learning experiences and providing teaching tools to higher education institutions, which is where our project got really exciting, certainly more complex, more comprehensive, more rigorous, but we've created now a really strong foundation for building upon. So, and the other part of the experiment was to do this collaboratively. And we have, within D-School, put our resources into writing and crafting, bringing on learning designers. But we, within this first stage, have already explored how can we do this collaboratively. So one of our stories was produced by AUC. There's another story in the making that comes from a human-centered design consultancy that's worked in Tanzania. So that's part of the project here, is that we do it together, as is the spirit of the Afrikan Design Thinking Network. So the process we've gone about is to, we started having this emerged from network conversations and scoping, with our advisory board guiding, and we have members of that advisory board here with us today. We then did a call for stories and welcomed input from others. And we went through a process of selecting which stories those are. Some came from the call, some came from our conversations and from the advisory. We then went about doing story development, and we've experimented with ways of doing that. We started off with one of our D-School coaches joining me in actually crafting a story and writing it, and then we tested it here within the foundation program in design thinking at the D-School. We went back to the drawing board, and then we also that's when AUC stepped in and Hoda produced a story that's in the format of a podcast. Then we realized, but wait a minute, when we write about these things, what is the conceptual framework around it? So we built a conceptual framework, which Rael assisted us with, and which really drew on sort of the curricular framework that you might hang these stories onto. Well, at the same time, we're not writing curricula here, and we're not dictating what the framework is for teaching design thinking. So that conceptual framework in itself is open to conversation and deliberation. And then, so with the learning design process, there's so much that got fleshed out. There's academic rigor in it. We're ensuring there's intellectual property respect. And, there's a lot of, so much we've learned. And Cheryl Hodgkinson-Williams is with us here in the room today, who's one of the learning designers that has worked with us, and we've learned so much. Also finding each other, how design thinking and learning design and what we all brought came together, and there was a real sort of trying to dance together and stepping on each other's feet for a while until we found our rhythm, and now we're really cruising and like waltzing around the ballroom. So, more African metaphor, so. Then we added teaching resources. So with the stories, there are slide decks, I'll show you that in a moment, and studio activities, and all these extras are what others can still contribute. Here we have the core of a story about something, but then we can go, oh, you could do this in your class. Oh, in my curriculum, we would rather teach it in this way. Add that resource, And then it's the testing and feedback process is where we're going into now. We've done testing already, but now we're really publishing these. They're out on a website. We're going to be showing them to you today if you come into the Deep Dive studio, and you can go and have a look at them through the network's website, and it's in testing phase. So now we really want to see, how does this land? We still have questions, and then the faces on that slide are just some of the people. On our website, you can see who was on the advisory board, who's the writers, the editors, the advisory, etc., subject matter experts. Some choices we made, as I've mentioned, working with learning designers became really important, developing activities and studio teaching activities and not just stories. An important direction was to build this as open educational resources. Some of you who write teaching cases know that often these are to be purchased. You need to buy them. These are free, and we've gone for Creative Commons licensing, CC BY. So they're open to adapting and using in your context. So as long as you attribute the authors. So we're very excited about this. I'm really emotional actually to be sharing it with you today. Those of you who have been on the journey, it's been long. We've gone through so many beautiful paths of discovery. It's been complex and messy at times, and it's really exciting to share them. Another thing is to balance this openness. It's a story, we can all use it, take it into your context, but also have academic rigor. So, and Cheryl and Kath Fortune, the other learning designer, has really made sure that we're not messing around here. This has got the University of Cape Town's name on it, and any other institutions, and it's got to stand up to that, you know. So when we stand up to what? Stand up to rigor, to accountability, to being answerable, to where this comes from, why we chose it, the kind of choices, and yet it's open. It's saying this is not the truth or the knowledge. It's an open conversation of they become living stories that invite conversation, and not saying this is the truth, go off and teach it like this. It's not prescriptive. Yeah, so it's intentionally unfinished. Testing phase now, we've got 3 stories published, 1 in the pipeline, and we are ready for you to come and tell us, does this work? How can it work better? What can we add? What is missing? What are our blind spots that we haven't seen? So we have so far these 3 stories. As I said, the one is this example from Kenya of a young Maasai herd boy who was responsible for looking after his cattle. And he didn't know he was using design thinking and didn't call it that, but he intuitively went through a process of experimentation and prototyping that demonstrates design thinking and how we actually can do this intuitively. So it's a really beautiful story. We draw on video resources that existed. Richard Turere himself knows that we've done this. And how do I make it stop? There we go. How do I make me stop? I've got to hurry up. Hoda's done the podcast, which is about design thinking and human-centered design in change management in organizations. So we're going to a completely different context here. And how can you apply, design thinking as change management and in business. The other story draws on an external resource. So it's a blog. We honor the author of that blog who writes about the groundnut oil extraction process and how even international agencies got it wrong because they didn't understand the gender dynamics. They didn't empathize enough with like, how is this actually going to affect women? We think we're going to help them, but actually the way we did this took it away from women. And put it in the hands of men. So another attempt, so it's a kind of a cautionary tale. It tells also about how design can go wrong and how we can do it better. And then the final one that's in the mix, that's still in the writing process for now, is this from Matchboxology, who worked with how can we bring down pediatric antiretroviral load. And they come up with a number of prototypes of how we can help children and parents better understand what viral load even means. And they came up with some brilliant prototypes, and one of them is a storybook, that these children actually finally understand what it means to have HIV and why it's important to take my medicine and how my blood is getting stronger and the virus is getting weaker, all told in a beautiful traditional storytelling format in Swahili. And that was taken up by the Ministry of Health in Tanzania. So it's a beautiful story, and how Matchboxology worked, incredible like co-design process, designing with people, really putting the process in their hands. So incredible story. And there are more in the making. We've got some of our D-School alumni, and there will be another call for stories, not right now, because we want to just test before we go forward. We want to know how should we go forward. With it, there's facilitator resources. So this is just a small preview, and we invite people to actually request them so that we can enter into conversation. So you provide your name and email address, and then you get to download these extra facilitator resources, and that way we enter into conversation. You join a teaching and learning community. It's not a one-way, off you go and use them. You come back and tell us, how was it? What would you do differently? What would you add? What did you do in your environments with the story? And we're inviting people to test out our website. So the journey is, anyone can read the story on the website. It's available for self-directed learning, or anyone, and then you can access the facilitator resource page, complete the form, you get your resources and use them, you can adapt them, you can share them back to the community in your format, in your adapted version, and then share feedback with us and explore the options for contribution. There are, teaching pieces in here, like a conceptual framework, as we imagined. Magenda, you might recommend the learning ladder. recognize the learning ladder that has evolved in the D-School. There's this framing. There's learning tools like the D-School's Mindset cards that are animated for a digital format. There's our narrator. This narrator takes you through the story. So there's a lot more questions. We're going to be exploring this in the studio in a moment. Asking these questions so that we can take it forward. And opportunities to share feedback and contribute resources to the existing stories. So if you come to the deep dive studio, so after this, after mine and 3 more presentations, we'll have a tea break, and then you get to choose where you want to go deeper into each of these. So in ours in Studio 1, we'll be exploring the website. You'll get to test it out and see it. And we want to hear your impressions, feedback, questions, and then share your experiences and ideas. We'll have some critical discussion and look at how you contextualize resources for your environment, and look at what it might take to iterate this project further. Thank you very much. Okay. Well done to everyone involved. Thank you. Okay. Shall I just introduce Babalwa? You can come up and do your piece. Thank you so much.
Molweni. Goeiemorgen. Hi, everyone. I think Jenny started us off really well this morning. She she welcomed us with the term sawubona. And today I also want to start with a word that speaks to sawubona in my own language. And if you will allow me a moment, indulge me just a little bit, I would like to share a story in the spirit of what Jenny has shared around this word that's on the screen. So during the early South African transition to democracy, my parents moved us from a rural village, Ngcongolo, to a township in what was then East London, and this township was called Ndebele, and then eventually to a predominantly white suburb called Amalinda. And so the word molo was part of our practice, right? It means hello. It was a warm word, a word that gave us meaning, that gave us identity and a sense of belonging. But in my kindergarten in Amalinda, there were folks, black and brown folks, who would pass by the kindergarten, ask for a job, ask for some food, and sometimes ask for a place for their children to stay. And I had heard the teachers use the same term, right, but use it differently. They would say molo when referring to the brown-skinned people that they saw, the molos. And in this way, they would other them, right? But that word felt really casual, right? It felt almost affectionate, descriptive. And I used it too. As a child, I was walking around calling every brown person, the molos, the molos, the molos. And one day, my mother, who is a prosecutor, stopped me. And in the very incisive way that prosecutors question their 4-year-old children, she asked me what I meant by that word. And in that moment of being questioned by my mother, I realized something that has stayed with me, right? That I was a molo. I was one of those others, right? I'd been using this word, absorbing it, repeating it, without actually understanding that it placed me outside the center of the world that it described. So that word wasn't just a word. It was a frame. And I had been living outside of it without even knowing that the walls were there. And so that childhood moment taught me something that I've spent years trying to name properly. Language is not a neutral vessel for meaning. Every word that we use communicates more than its definition. It communicates power. Who gets to name things? It communicates value. Who is at the center and who is at the periphery? It communicates identity, right? Who belongs and who is othered. And much of this happens in the unsaid, in what is implied, in what we take for granted because everyone around us is also taking it for granted. So this is what I mean when I say that language is a frame, right? A frame doesn't just hold a picture. It tells you what is worth looking at. And crucially, it tells you what falls outside its edges. So what does that have to do with design thinking? I'm sure everyone in this room can answer that question because we've been discussing it in depth, right, over the past few days. Right, design thinking is a methodology that is built on language. Its stages, its tools, its mindsets, they are all alive within words. So empathy, ideation, prototype, user, human-centered, wicked, problem, these are not neutral technical terms. They arrived from a particular place, a particular institution, a particular culture, and a particular moment in history. So that context, it is Stanford, right? It is the late 20th century. It's Silicon Valley. It is a predominantly Western English language way of naming how we solve problems. And here's the thing about frames, right? Because once they become standard, once they're taught in universities and embedded in toolkits and repeated in workshops, they stop feeling like choices and they start feeling like facts. Now that's subtle normalization. That moment when frames become invisible is, I want to argue, one of the most important challenges that design thinking faces as it travels the world. And I want to be clear that I didn't arrive at this problem alone, okay? This question has been raised by colleagues, by design practitioners who have felt the friction of working in a methodology that doesn't quite have the words for what they know. By language experts who study how knowledge and systems interact and collide, by educators who are working at the edges of design thinking and who have asked themselves, whose knowledge is this? And who was it made for? And within this school in particular, this conversation has surfaced many a times through the d.confestival, through the work of the GDTA, through the stories project that we've heard from Jenni. So this isn't a fringe concern. It is increasingly recognized as a central one. And so the research that I have done that I'd like to present today contributes to that larger conversation. So the research I want to share today set out to do something specific, to look at language in design thinking systemically, across multiple schools of thought, and to particularly ask, what does language do? What does it assume? What does it leave out? And so this methodology was shaped by a couple of things, but particularly three influences. First, decolonial frameworks, which asks us to notice whose knowledge actually counts and whose does not. Second, it was rooted in critical pedagogy, right, which is the tradition that insists that education is never politically neutral. It is always bound up with power. And third is linguistic anthropology. This is the study of language and how it doesn't just describe the world, but how it actually constructs it. Of course, my own positionality as well was part of the methodology, because I am an African practitioner, and I'm looking at a field that was largely built elsewhere. And that vantage point, I don't think is a limitation. I believe it to be part of the research. I think it is a research instrument. And so the output of this research is a glossary, right? It's not a dictionary, because a dictionary tells you what a word means, whereas this glossary actually just asks us where the words come from, what it assumes, how it translates, and what is missing. So we took terms that appear consistently across design thinking curricula and toolkits, terms like empathy, like bias, like ideation, prototype, human-centered, all the words that we know, and we cross-referenced them across multiple schools of thought. So the Stanford's D School, IDEO, HPI, and also emerging African and indigenous frameworks, like those that are presented in the work of Amolo Ambole, HCD Afrika, and PADI. And the questions that we asked of each of these terms were, where does this word come from? What does it assume about the person who is using it and the people who are being designed for? What does it translate or not in other contexts? And what does this translation actually reveal? And then lastly, it asked what concept or practice exists in other knowledge systems that this term fails to capture. And from this research, 3 things stood out. First, some terms are loaded, right? And they're loaded in ways that we rarely acknowledge. Take empathy, for example. In a Western psychological framing, empathy is about imaginative projection. You step into someone else's shoes. But in many African relational philosophies, this kind of individual imaginative act is not actually how you understand others. You understand others through relationship, through community, through being with, not through imagining being, right? So it's the same word, but in a different world. Second, cross-referencing the glossary across schools of thought revealed that the same word can carry meaningfully different weight depending on who is teaching it and in what context it is being taught. So the field is not one thing, and that multiplicity is in itself a very important finding. And then third is just the reality that there are terms that are missing, right? Concepts that exist in African and indigenous knowledge systems, so ways of talking about collective wisdom, about witnessing, about the responsibilities of the practitioner, simply don't have terms within our current design thinking lexicon, right? So the lexicon has gaps, and those gaps are not accidental. And so I want us to think about where this work goes, right? And I want to be honest here is that we have not arrived here. This is where a direction that we want to take this work, and we're hoping that you will help us in terms of thinking about where the future possibilities lie. The first direction, and not necessarily in chronological order, is translation experiments, right? So this is obviously not something that we have done yet, but it's something that the glossary is ready to test. The idea is to take design thinking terms in other languages and watch what happens. What survives intact, right? What transforms in the crossing from one language to the other? What has no equivalent at all? So when a term cannot be translated, that absence is actually a data point. It tells us what that concept was assuming all along and possibly who it was excluding. The second direction is cultivating new terms from within communities of practice, right? This is not about importing a language from the outside, but growing it from within African cities, from indigenous knowledge keepers, from the practitioners in the global majority who are already adapting design thinking on their own terms and often without the field noticing. And the third is a living glossary, this glossary that we have started with, and that is an ongoing method, not a finished document. The most important question it keeps asking is what concepts from African and indigenous knowledge systems are still missing from design thinking language? What would it mean to name them on our own terms, not as additions to the existing lexicon, but possibly as challenges to it? And to borrow from what our keynote speaker Pumla spoke about yesterday, we challenge not necessarily to reject, but to refine. And so I want to close, because the timer has gone, with an invitation to play, right? Design thinking positions itself as a methodology for tackling wicked problems. The complex, the systemic, human challenges that often don't have clean solutions. Right? So when we talk about climate, inequality, health, education, the recentering of African knowledge, the dismantling of systems that were not built for everyone. But quite critically for me is the question if we, as practitioners, as educators, as design thinkers, are equipped with the mental models we need for that work. Or are we working with a set of inherited frames that are built from a different set of problems in a different world? So that Molo moment that I started with, it stays with me. because it is a lesson in what it feels like to suddenly see the frame you've been living inside. It can be uncomfortable. It requires you to reposition yourself, and then, if you're willing, it opens something. So this research is an invitation to that kind of seeing. This glossary is a starting point, it's not a conclusion. And so I invite you, after the break, during the hour that we will spend together, to play. Play with me, with language, and through play, which is really just an indigenous practice for knowledge generation and experimentation, we will explore these terms that we use in our own creative practices through the dimensions of residence, of comprehension, and of translation. And so I invite you, not as an audience, but as fellow players and collaborators.
I was asked to set my clock to 10 or 12. I will set it to 10, and I will try and be brief. Good morning, everybody. I feel like we need a moment to just sit in Babalwa's talk. I think it's so powerful, the work and the research that she's doing. It's phenomenal. I'm hoping that we can build on that work as well. And the way I'd like to do that is I was offered the theme of rethink. And I'd like to give you two provocations today. Not necessarily truths, but provocations. Provocations that might help drive our thinking forward within the space of design thinking. And so as we rethink, I'd like you to think about design thinking mindsets and the methods that we engage with in our daily practice. What might these look like? And how might we advance our practice? Just a high level, I think Babalwa did a fantastic a job of sort of outlining some of the language that we use and some of the namings that we have around mindsets and methods. So this will be quite familiar with you. I won't stick around here too long. But the first provocation I'd like to give you is contextual. It's really linked with the type of world that students are emerging into. We've spoken about wicked problems. But I think what increasingly we're seeing is this polycrisis, where wicked problems don't exist in isolation, but they bump up against each other, they interact with each other, they compound each other. And so increasingly, I think what we're doing is, as we emerge from our practices or from our education, we're needing to engage with these polycrises. They're global. We can't avoid what's happening in other countries. I think increasingly we're seeing what happens in one place, impacts us. And so we need this awareness. These are multiple challenges, as I say, that interact and potentially worsen each other, creating bigger crises. And I think this is the kind of landscape that we need to be mindful of when thinking about our own practice and how do we emerge into these spaces. We've spoken about wicked problems, but I think what's really interesting is the research that's emerging from Africa around wicked problems is actually more complexity around dual wickedness. This is a term that's emerging in the research around wicked problems in South Africa and within Africa, where wicked problems don't exist in isolation, but they exist often in systems that themselves are wicked. And so we get this compounding of wickedness. We can't design problems or design for solutions in isolation. One example is within South Africa, if we look at education inequality, a wicked problem in its own. But it also exists in a system where 3 out of 4 public school learners depend on food. So we might solve access, and Kasturi spoke about this earlier. What do universities do really well? We can improve access, but we're improving access within a system where people still can't learn because they're hungry. And so we can't just solve one problem, and this requires multidimensionality, it requires transdisciplinary work, it requires thinking beyond just the scope of what we do. So how do we bring different minds, different knowledges into the work that we do? There was a meta-analysis done of academic papers focusing on wicked problems and how they manifest themselves across the continent. And what's really interesting is the top, that ambiguity, that they emerged as kind of one of the core themes within wicked problems in Africa. This idea that multiplicity exists at the same time, different truths exist at the same time. How do we actually then work within a space where truths compete? And I think these are the kind of mindsets and the methods that we need to start developing our students towards, is how do we engage with these complexities that exist? Not just looking at a nice problem frame and saying that's the problem, but realizing that this problem actually has an overlapping other problems as well. And so the first provocation I give you is that design thinking emerged from contexts of abundance and institutional stability. We've spoken about, the ideas, the global minorities, the IDOs, and the other spaces. But wicked problems in Africa unfold in contexts of often scarcity, structural inequities, and interlocking crises, often creating this idea of dual wickedness. And so the first question that I'd like us to engage around is, how might we rethink our mindsets and methods so that we might better engage with the complexity of how wicked problems manifest themselves across the continent? All right, around the context. The second provocation I'd like us to engage with are the archives of knowledge. Babalwa spoke fantastically toward this just now. But I was watching a talk on a historian, a historical thinker, and one of the things that he said was, what kind of past do we carry around? For what uses in the present, and with what vision for the future? So in historical thinking, design is very forward-looking, but I think increasingly what's entering the conversation is that we need to look backwards. We need to look at what voices haven't been included in our conversations up until this point. Not just build on what we have now, but actually start to look at saying, how do we bring those voices into the conversation? And so this is a provocation that I like to sit with often in my own work, is to think about what kind of past do I carry around, for what uses in the present, and with what vision for the future? And how do I then maybe draw on other knowledges if those aren't sufficient? A very interesting map on science publications. We exist in the academic space, I do partly. And I think what's challenging about this is if you look at the academic papers and where publications are emerging from, this is a knowledge map of the world. Africa, one of the largest continents, that little sliver underneath there, extremely rich in knowledge, but in the academic space, that's not necessarily the information that we're drawing on. So how do we bring in other knowledges that aren't necessarily, or haven't necessarily been acknowledged in the traditional academic sense? I think what's increasingly we have to ask ourselves is, who created the archives that we draw from as practitioners? And how might we include maybe more voices or non-traditional voices within that space? Amina Mama, in an article on, is it ethical to study Africa? She stated that most of that which we receive about Africa is produced in the West. And I think that's a key provocation in itself. We often talk about transdisciplinarity within design and design thinking, the bringing together of many different disciplines. But I think what we need to shift is our framing of transdisciplinarity, not just disciplines within a university, but different ways of knowing. There's many different branches of knowledge that exist outside of the university: experiential knowledge, lived experiences, indigenous knowledges that aren't necessarily sitting nice and neatly within a university. So when we talk about transdisciplinarity, we're not just talking about design and engineering and the sciences and education. We're talking about what other knowledges exist. And I think that's increasingly important, is the work that, and Janice touched on it as well earlier, the idea of a university as a reparative institution. How do we actually start to bring in other knowledges into the space? And how do we do that in a very sort of, in an ethical and in a productive way? If we look at the origins of design thinking in its general form, we see it draws a lot on industrial design with human-centered design, architecture planning, Horst and Rittel's work on wicked problems, anthropology, ethnography, a lot around cognitive science. And what I did was I mapped a lot of these to kind of a global map. And if we look at a lot of the mindsets and methods that we embrace and that we utilize in design thinking, we're drawing largely from the northern minority. And it's not to say that these aren't good. They're fantastic. But are they sufficient for the context in which we need to engage? And I think that's one of the questions that we need to keep asking. Another map, because I do like maps as visual learning tools, is this is the map that shows the actual size of the world, not the Mercator, which we often see. And I think when we look at it like this, the size of Africa, the multiple worlds that exist within this space is incredible. And just looking at it visually, we can start to think about how many knowledges, how many different ways of knowing, doing, being actually exist that we might not be engaging with. And so how do we do that? I think one of the ways is to shift our framing from kind of universal design thinking practice, into pluriversal ways. And we saw a little bit about this yesterday in the talk about contextual versions of design thinking. Not all adopting the same, but how do we actually build design thinking from the ground up based on where we are, the context we live in, the cultures we engage with, and the challenges that we face. And so my last slide in this sense is, this slide is not upside down. That's the universal framing of the world is the global north and the global south. I think those are two aspects that we need to flip. And I think I'd like us to, as we go into this next session, question the status quo. When we think about thinking, we need to relax our beliefs, what we take for granted, what we take as a status quo, and really start questioning that. And so as we move into the next session, what I'd love to do with you as well is to have this 1-hour participatory workshop, not talk about just the mindsets and the methods that we currently use, but really engage the different knowledges, the different intelligences, the different experiences that are in this space that we're so lucky to have today, and start to think about this. And we're going to dive into 2 questions. One, what knowledges and mindsets are needed to engage with dual wickedness? And the other, how might African knowledges be recentered in design thinking practices that currently rely heavily on Western archives? Thank you. And I would like to hand over to Precious.
Thank you. Okay, get my timer right. Babalwa, thank you so much for that story you shared. It just really made me realize that I am a Molo, and it emphasized how powerful language is and how we interpret language means so much to everyone. Thank you so much for that. Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to have you here at the D School. So my R word is resolve. Where's my presentation? Let's give them a second. So my R word is resolve, and today I'll be talking about design thinking research and ripples of change. So today I'd really like us to think of design thinking not as an innovation tool, but as a transformative ability on humans, to have a transformative ability on humans and organizations abroad. So when we think about design thinking and we think about problem solving, we often default to a mindset of certainty. We are often taught to value speed, to value efficiency and definitive answers. But what happens when we are trying to solve complex problems that require non-linear solutions? What happens when we are actually forced to put our standard matrix down and to listen to the people we are trying to solve for? So the story I'd like to tell you about today is that of a journey of transformation. This is a study that I did on the Advanced Leadership Certificates in Design Thinking program, which was a qualitative research study. This program is offered to senior executive managers in Sanlam, and the program itself was collaboratively designed by the D School, the Graduate School of Business, and Sanlam. The aim of this program is to actually cultivate creative confidence, strengthen adaptive leadership, and equip employees with human-centered approaches to problem solving. This was supposed to be a simple learning tool, but what we found with the results and the data is that it was quite a transformative experience for the learners involved. So the data source I'm speaking to comes from surveys, interviews, and reflection papers that the participants submitted during the program. It was quite a big group from 2028 to 2024. We've had about 300 participants, and it was quite a rich set of data that we were able to speak to in terms of their transformation. So if we're talking about ripples of change, right, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Transformation occurs through ripples. And today I want us to talk to these ripples through the self, which will talk to the unraveling of the self, the unbecoming. And then we'll talk to how the self influences the relationships that we begin to form. And then from there, we'll talk to how these relationships eventually impacts the entire system that we are a part of. So the first ripple about identity transformation and the unraveling of certainty. So the participants of the advanced leadership certificates were competent, accomplished individuals who found themselves in a corporate culture that actually values speed, control, and certainty. Now, they are fixers by nature. They work in the financial services institution. They work with money. They are meant to fix those problems, right? But when they walked into the design thinking studio, they were being asked something completely different. They were being asked to pause, to listen, to stop solving. And as you can imagine, this was the first big discomforts that they experienced in the program. So this discomfort was essentially the first catalyst that we saw as the first ripple of change. They had a deep internal shift in identity. The program acted as a mirror for them, asking them to actually question how much of themselves they had edited to fit the cultural corporate norms. So through psychological safety, however, they were able to convert that confusion that they had, the discomfort and the vulnerability, into a learning opportunity. They began to strip away from their corporate armor and become who they really were. So just taking you through some of the codes that came out, we had participants S19 saying, I was confused and uncomfortable a lot, but that's where the growth happened. Participants S22 said, the uncertain spaces before solutioning was the hardest part. And S19 said, I had to accept things about myself. So how many of us have to accept things about ourselves? When they were asked to describe the transformation metaphorically, participants used vivid imagery. So that those animals that we see around the boardroom there were some of the descriptions they saw themselves as. They spoke of becoming eagles, ready to soar, the statue of David carefully chiseled from a marble. S24 beautifully captured her journey as saying, a beautiful butterfly in the metamorphosis phase. The cocoon had to break from within. You can't force it to open. You have to fight your way out so that your wings become strong enough to fly. So they're just emphasizing the ability was always within to transform. The second ripple, speaking to human-centered leadership in action. So when we change how we see ourselves, that automatically or sometimes will eventually transcend to how we see the relationships we are involved in. And so we saw this happen with the participants changing the team dynamics and the relationships that they influenced within the organization. One of the most pivotal shifts here was the transition from being an answer giver to a sense maker. So participants realized that their instincts to always jump into solution mode was actually silencing their collaborators and their colleagues. So they began to value holding space for one another. Excuse me. They valued emotion alongside corporate logic. They also started valuing the collective versus the individual creative genius. So this shift from fixing to listening is a human-centered leadership in action traits that we all kind of understand. Just drawing from some of the quotes that they said, participants, S22 said, creating a safe space for my team changed how we began to work. And then lastly, looking at the last ripple, the system in which they came from. So what happens when these transformed individuals, armed with empathy and tolerance for ambiguity, return to a system built on efficiency and strict matrix? This brings us to the third ripple, organizational change. And this is where the water got a bit choppy. Despite the profound individual growth, translating these learnings into the system, the organization became quite a big challenge. Participants S24 highlighted that the organization is still stuck in old ways. There are layers, there are politics, and there's resistance. Change is happening, but it is happening slowly. So this highlights a well-known tension in organizational learning, that individual transformation might not always automatically equate to organizational transformation. Participants faced structured constraints, performance pressures, and sometimes a lack of senior leadership buy-in in terms of implementing their learnings. As they became known for their listening skills, which they had learned in the design thinking sessions, some even risked becoming informal counselors within the organization. And this highlights the lack of systemic structures to distribute emotional labor. If we want these ripples to create lasting tide, the organization itself must adapt. Without intentional structural alignment in communities of practice, creative confidence risks becoming or remaining localized with brave individuals, rather than becoming embedded as a capability within the organization. To conclude, the Advanced Leadership Certificate program has proven to be quite a vigorous method for transformation. It acted as a catalyst, asking us to return back to our humanity. It breaks down the armor of certainty, replaces fixing with listening, and challenges the broader system to become more adaptive and empathetic. Through the messy, non-linear journey of the program, there was one phrase that the participants clung to, initially with resistance, but eventually found profound belief, and that is trust the process. As participants 23 highlighted, this trust the process is not just a phase within the design thinking school, but it is something we need to adapt as we go through life itself. And lastly, just to touch on my own transformation. So within the D school itself, I am a scientist coming into a design thinking space. I myself have had to transform and go through uncertainty and ambiguity. So this speaks a lot to just what happens when we question ourselves, how we are becoming, who we are becoming. And as a researcher, I started questioning, how do we put knowledge together? I had the quantitative on one side, which I had been trained with all my life, and suddenly walking into the space where it's human-centered, I had to speak to people, I had to converse and form meaning out of data, which was words. And that is, on its own, was a big transformation on my behalf. So in Studio 4 today, I want to invite you to come and reflect. Reflect on your own practice. Reflect on your own ability and your transformation in the journey of becoming design thinking practitioners, researchers, whatever you may call yourself. And I hope by the end of that session, we'll be able to kind of figure out what are the ripples of change that are on our control or are in our own control? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Precious. Thank you for sharing that. Right, everyone, we're going to have a tea break now, but first I want to invite you to consider which of those 4 topics you would like to explore further in the deep dive studio after tea. So here we have the studios, as you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. So in Studio 1, I'll be with the Afrikan Design Thinking Stories. Studio 2 will be Babalwa with the reframe and the language conversation. Studio 3 upstairs will be Rael with the rethink and the invitation he posed. And Studio 4 will be Precious, inviting you to reflect on your journey and her invitation. So may I ask you to use the Event Mobi tool at this point to answer a poll, because we'd like to even the numbers out so that we don't have 50 people here and 10 there. We've got some really beautiful exploration, interactive work to do. So we'd like to keep the numbers sort of at roughly. So if you can get your Event Mobi out, there's the poll is going to guide us to what the numbers are looking like. Some people have already selected. So if you can go to your Event Mobi the website, if you've been accessing it, there's a poll that will pop up and you can choose your studio. If we see that, this will hopefully show us that numbers are even. How does that sound? Has everyone got the website? Is this going to work? Is everyone using it? No. Okay, what are we going to do? Shall we do a show of hands? Should we do a show of hands? Is that going to work better? Okay. All right, so put your hands up, and so I have some eyes to help me. The team presenting and hosting, can you help me look? Rael, a few, or ushers, Annie, assist. Hands nice and high so we can see, all right. If you want to go to Studio 1, please raise your arms up. Okay. Okay, I'm seeing about 10 hands, 11, great, 12. Thank you. Okay, Studio 2 with Babalwa. Okay, I'm seeing 8 hands. 9, right? Okay, that's all right. Let's see Studio 3, the rethink with Rael. Okay, so there's about up to 20 people there. You can do 20, Rael. That's great. And then resolve with Precious. Let's see hands nice and high. We're good. We're good. Okay, so the numbers are pretty even. That's great. We're all equally popular. So we can go, when you come back from tea, you're going to go to your studio quite promptly. Please get to the what is it, 11:30 we start. So we'll get tea downstairs and go. But first, before you go, Annie's going to just talk to you about field visits quickly. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So just quickly speaking to the field visits, your tea time is going to be 11 to 11:30. 11:30 to 12:30 we'll have our deep dives, as Jenny mentioned. Thereafter, you only have 30 minutes. 30 minutes to visit the restroom, for you to get your lunch. There will be a packed lunch for you. We will explain exactly where that will be. Jenny, I'm not sure if you know where the packed lunches are yet. Will they be brought to everybody in this area? So please come to the atrium. And then there'll be people guiding you. There will be people with little, look at them, with their lollipop squares. There we go on the different field visits. Maybe I can just remind you, number 1 is the one that's Sustainability Institute. Number 2 is the Muizenberg trip. Number 3 is the PHA, that's a Philippine Horticulturalist Association. And number 4 is the CDI, the waterfront. And then number 5 is going to be the visit to Langa. All right, so these representatives will take you out to the buses you need to go to. Thank you. Let's give them a hand, don't they look schnazzle? Well done. Before we go to tea, I would like to acknowledge somebody. And the person I'd like to acknowledge is the head of the Learning and Discovery Lab at the D School, and that's Janice. I'm not sure where she's disappeared. There Janice is. I'd just like to acknowledge Janice for her work. Janice joined UCT in 1994 in the Department of Adult Education. Since then, she's moved to various roles at CHED. She's also been the director of the UCT Global Citizen Program. She has worked at institutional level beyond CHED, where she was the social responsiveness coordinator and had to report to the DVC. And since 2020, Jenni has been, or she's contributed towards UCT's dismantling of institutional racism. And that's where her heart lies. And since about 2022, I think it is, we've been lucky to have her in our fold. Janice, we acknowledge the work that you do. It's hugely important, and we wish you all the best for the next 10 years. Let's give her a hand. Janice McMillan. Thank you, everybody. Let's go and enjoy our tea, and then off to our deep dive. See you later.